There's this tiny pair of shoes sitting behind glass in museums. They're embroidered, delicate, almost pretty. And at first, your brain goes, oh, baby shoes. But then you look closer, the label says they belong to an adult woman, and suddenly the whole thing feels wrong. Because these weren't baby shoes, these were Lotus shoes. And the only reason an adult woman could fit into them is because her feet had been broken, folded, wrapped, and reshaped when she was still a little girl. So today, we're talking about one of the most haunting beauty standards in history, Chinese foot binding. Foot binding was not just about feet. It was about control, class, womanhood, marriage. It was about the horrifying idea that pain could make a girl more valuable. And honestly, that is where this story gets dark, because every generation has a beauty standard that pressures people to endure pain in order to be accepted. This was one of China's most famous examples. So let's start with the shoes itself, the Lotus shoe. Lotus shoes were tiny shoes made for women with bound feet. They were often beautifully decorated. Some were embroidered with flowers, birds, symbols of luck, or wedding imagery. Some were made from silk, cotton, or other textiles. Some were for daily wear, some were for weddings, some were for sleeping, some were made to be seen, some were deeply personal. And the name Lotus matters. Bound feet were often called lotus feet, and the most desirable version was sometimes called the golden lotus. That phrase sounds poetic, right? Golden lotus. It sounds soft, feminine, elegant, almost romantic. But the reality underneath it was not romantic at all. The so-called golden lotus referred to extremely small bound feet, sometimes idealized as around 3 inches long. 3 inches. That is smaller than a lot of phones. And when museum curators or historians hold Lotus shoes, a lot of them describe the same feeling, shock. Because your brain wants to say, this must have belonged to a child, but no. These were worn by adult women whose feet had been altered from childhood. And that is the first disturbing thing about Lotus shoes. They are beautiful objects connected to a brutal practice. They are art, but they are also a reflection of a beauty standard. A beauty standard that required a girl's body to be changed before she even fully understood what the world expected from her. The exact origin of foot binding is debated, but many historians trace it back to elite culture around the Song dynasty. There is also a famous story about a court dancer named Yao Niang who supposedly bound her feet into the shape of a new moon and danced before Emperor Lei Yu on a golden lotus platform. Now, that story is often repeated, but we should treat it carefully. A lot of beauty traditions have origin stories that sound very neat and dramatic, but history is usually messier than that. What seems clearer is that foot binding became associated with elite women, court culture, erotic beauty, and refinement. At first, it was not something every woman did. It was connected to privilege. If a woman had bound feet, that could signal she didn't need to work in the fields. She belonged to a household with enough status, money, or ambition to keep her inside. And this is where we see the pattern. Beauty standards often begin as status symbols. And bound feet suggested that a woman was clean and high status enough to just do pretty much nothing, which is terrifying when you say it out loud. Because imagine a society where limited movement becomes a beauty goal. Not about strength, comfort, or health, but limited movement. And that is the world that Lotus shoes came from. Now let's talk about the people who practice foot binding. Foot binding was mainly practiced among Han Chinese women. That detail matters because not every woman in China practiced it. China has many ethnic groups, and foot binding was not universal across all of them. Manchu women, for example, generally did not bind their feet, even though the Qing dynasty was ruled by Manchus. So when we talk about foot binding, we need to be specific. This was not all Chinese women forever. It varied by region, class, time period, and ethnicity. But among many Han Chinese communities, especially in later dynasties, it became a powerful social norm. By the Ming and Qing periods, the practice had spread much more widely. It was no longer only about elite court women. Common families also began copying it. And that is how a beauty standard becomes dangerous, because once something is tied to status and marriage, families start feeling like they have no choice. A mother might bind her daughter's feet not because she wanted to, but because she feared what would happen if she didn't. Would her daughter be considered ugly? Would she be rejected for marriage? Would the family lose status? Would people whisper? Would she be seen as rough, poor, improper, or undesirable? That's the part that makes this history so heavy. It wasn't always just evil people forcing a trend. It was a whole system. a system where women could become enforcers of the very thing that hurt them because they were trying to help the next generation survive inside the rules they were given. And that is so important to understand. Foot binding was patriarchal, yes. It controlled women's bodies, yes. But the people physically doing the binding were often women in the household, mothers, grandmothers, older female relatives. And that makes the story more complicated, not less painful, more complicated. Because beauty standards survive when people start believing harm is protection. Foot binding did not end overnight. There were attempts to oppose it for a long time, but by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, opposition became much stronger. Some Chinese reformers criticized foot binding. Some missionaries opposed it. Anti-foot binding societies formed. Families were encouraged to promise that they would not bind their daughters' feet. Some reformers argued that foot binding harmed women's health. Others argued that it made China look weak or backward in the eyes of the world. So even the movement against foot binding had layers. But the result was that the practice began to lose social power. In 1912, after the fall of the Qing dynasty and the creation of the Republic of China, foot binding was officially banned. But by the mid-20th century, foot binding had largely disappeared as a new practice. So that is the dark history of lotus shoes and foot binding in China. A beauty standard so small you could hold it in your hand, but so powerful it shaped women's lives for centuries. And if this story made you think of a modern beauty standard that people treat as normal now but might look horrifying in the future, comment it below. Because sometimes the most dangerous standards are the ones everyone around us has already accepted.